Developer Bloober Team brings its Silent Hill 2 remake to Xbox consoles after a year-long wait, and as a pure technical exercise, the Series S version is the main point of interest here. It's the most intriguing release because as a trend across this generation, Unreal Engine 5 games like this, with Lumen Reflections and GI, have tended to face heavier compromises on the system. Due to its 4 teraflop chipset, smaller 10GB pool of RAM, and memory bandwidth limits, either one of 3 things typically seems to happen. The first is that key visual features are chopped outright on Series S, like Lumen GI, screen space reflections, and character shadows in Marvel Rivals, in order to make 60 FPS viable. It's a pretty ruthless tactic to hit 60, but it works well via that visual trade-off. Approach number 2 is allowing the native resolution to drop to very rough, low figures, like 432p in Lords of the Fallen's case, to keep UE5 features like Lumen and Nanite in place on an optional 60fps mode. Image quality takes a nosedive in Lords of the Fallen, but again we keep 60fps and Lumen there. The third method, it seems, is the one that Silent Hill 2 Remake opts for today, to cap the game at 30fps on Series S and remove the 60fps performance option seen on the other platforms. Okay, you might think, fair enough, 30fps it shall be, so long as the visuals we're getting are at least on par with the performance modes on the other consoles. In reality though, it turns out capping at 30fps isn't the only drawback on Series S, and the other visual trade-offs put in place run deeper than you might expect. The first point in true DF tradition relates to resolution. On Series S, the game renders at 1280 by 720 with Unreal's built-in temporal super resolution, TSR, as the upscaler of choice. Now, this isn't the worst we've seen in a UE5 Series S release by any means, but it's still an obvious hit next to Series X. On the plus side, I've seen no deviations under 720p, it's unwavering even in GPU intensive areas like the early Woodland route, where frames would normally drop on the 60fps modes on the other consoles. In other words, if we were to see a DRS adjustment, it'd likely be here. Still, in comparison, even rendering at 720p does present a challenge for TSR's attempt to reconstruct image detail, especially on fine elements like power lines, fences, and hair. For context, Series X uses the same dynamic res setup of PS5 and PS5 Pro. That's 864p to 1152p on the performance mode, and 1224p to 1512p on the quality mode. Zooming in, you'll see the tufts of James's hair are more dithered on Series S as we walk forward, plus you'll also notice heavier disocclusion artifacts. As his head sways left to right with each stride, the tarmac ahead is revealed and obscured constantly, giving TSR no real chance to reconstruct that detail properly. This blocking artifact is a problem on Series X's quality and performance modes too, but amplified with the 720p image on Series S. In fairness, for any up-close detail in apartments or bars, there's far less of an issue, and 720p is perfectly fine there. But for any long views outdoors, the structure of those dangling power lines overhead struggles to resolve, and they flicker in and out of view. And likewise, the mesh pattern on fences fails to materialize at range as it should with Series S's limited pixel data. Bits of the pattern disappear on approach, and it only truly takes shape once you're a few meters away. Point number 2. In Silent Hill 2 Remake, Bloober Team of course leans heavily on UE5 features to recreate the PS2 original's eerie haunted atmosphere. Key to that is Lumen Reflections and Lumen Global Illumination, approximate software-based forms of ray tracing that fills its puzzles with detail outside of screen space and also simulates light bounce in darkened areas. Alongside its heavy fog effect, Lumen is an essential ingredient to the game's aesthetic. It's baked into its design. Inevitably then, on Xbox Series X, we see the same software-based Lumen Reflection and Lumen GI in place as on PS5 consoles. Series X uses the same settings as on PS5's 2 modes, where once again, a 30fps quality mode offers a boost in signed distant field accuracy for reflections and GI. Meanwhile, just as with PS5, the 60fps performance mode on Series X reverts to a lower resolution flickering setting for reflections and lower GI accuracy. No difference to PS5 either way, in other words, and Series X demands the very same visual trade-off to get to 60fps. Sadly, on Series S, the accuracy of Lumen reflections takes a further hit, even compared to the already blocky results on the 60fps performance modes on the other consoles. This is really the biggest complaint I've got with Series S. Knowing it only runs at 720p and 30fps is maybe something we have to accept, but the fact that Lumen reflections are so compromised on top of that is a real shame. This aliasing is everywhere too, not just in the puddles across the town, but also the damp floorboards of the apartments. The SDF accuracy of Series S's Lumen reflections is lowered to such a visible degree here, and surprisingly Bloober's established an even lower setting to run at here. On top of this hit to reflections, Lumen global illumination is also affected on Series S. Diffuse and indirect lighting in darkened spaces is still present here, but in this aspect, Bloober further decreases the accuracy of the effect. So, across the underside of this well, there's a spectrum of returns on the GI's impact, ranging from Series S with its minimal GI light bounce, to Series X in performance mode, and then quality mode as the best case on console. On the plus side, ambient occlusion shading on Series S does at least run at equivalent to Series X's performance mode setting. The shading under grass in this panning shot is lacking next to the quality mode, but Series S is still broadly on par with that 60fps option. On a more general level, Series S does sadly drop several other key settings. Most notably, texture quality is lowered, meaning car bodies, rusted doors, wood grain, the fabric on James's jeans, and even the Silent Hill map all use lower res assets. This one's easily explained by Series S's RAM limits, but again, it's a shame to see. And returning to this early checkpoint, it's also clear that its tessellation setting is also dropped. Flipping between Series S and Series X in either mode, we're getting a lower quality geometric mesh for the rocks here. Thanks to all of those cutbacks on Series S, there is at least one positive turnout in performance. Yes, it may just be 30fps, but it's generally a solid 30 based on the opening few hours of testing. I say generally because in terms of typically GPU-bound regions, there are no actual lurches under target so far. The woodlands, the town streets all run perfectly. The one issue though that has stuck out is some traversal stutters. I'd be curious to hear other Series S users' experience with this, because I've had 3 large frame time spikes in the Woodside apartment portion of the game. The general outlook for performance is very solid, if not for these odd stutters on Series S. You might get away unscathed, but it's certainly worth mentioning. On Series X, the result is more or less business as usual if you're familiar with the PS5 versions. The 30fps quality mode runs well for the most part, but it's not totally immune to drops. Again, 95% of the time, this is locked at 30fps, but to summarize some of the dips I've experienced, there's a hitch just before we pick up the torch. Again, a sign that traversal stutters may be a factor on Series X later on. And secondly, more typically GPU-associated drops occur as these enemies projectile vomit at the screen. This sudden burst of effects causes dips into the high 20s, which the DRS adjusts to restore 30 in the moment. Ultimately then, it's not rock solid, but overall, Series X holds close to 30 if you want to keep those better Lumen settings in place on quality mode. The performance mode, on the other hand, is more variable in nature, just like on base PS5 and even PS5 Pro. Across the opening woodland area, Series X runs in the 45 to 60fps range with screen tearing in tow, whereas the PS5 consoles are V-synced at least. And in comparing the 3 during that taxing woodland route, Series X has a slight performance lead by around 2 to 3 FPS. It's more than margin of error stuff and seems consistent enough, though ultimately this whole route is prime VRR material for anyone with a supporting display. Beyond that, within the town and the apartment block later on, performance is more typically at 60fps. Again, there are specific moments and areas that lurch briefly into the 50s, so any sudden camera swing to a foggy area or an enemy is usually a culprit in this respect. In short, just like on PS5 systems, you'll need that VRR display to enjoy this mode with perceptually smooth motion throughout. On reflection, a whole year later, Silent Hill 2 Remake is a worthy modern take on a horror classic built on Unreal Engine 5. The outcome on a tech level pans out as you might expect on Series X2, and you're getting a solid console rendition of the game, I'd say, with similar triggers for frame rate drops as on base PS5. As for Series S users, there's more to consider before diving in. The use of UE5's Lumen is essential, and that's a sticking point for such a power-limited machine. Series S ends up keeping Lumen reflections and GI, but in a noticeably dialed back form. To even a non-tech-savvy player, the most distracting part of the package will be the way its reconstructed 720p image comes bundled with those flickering issues, and also those sharp, blocky Lumen reflections. So for the best first-time experience, it's really hard to recommend on this console, but accepting those points, it is at least a mostly stable 30fps experience. That's the state of Silent Hill 2 Remake on Xbox. If you did enjoy this video, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell for instant notifications as any new video lands. Please do check out our Patreon to support what we do at Digital Foundry, and to get in touch directly, you know where to find us. But for now, thanks for watching.